Hello, everybody. It's the Ice Bath podcast, and it's number 12. And I'm delighted today to have Gavin Ball with me from GDB Consulting.
Hi,
Welcome,
Colin.
Gavin.
Hi, Colin. Yeah, good to be with you. Looking forward to having a chat.
Yep, brilliant. So, your background, and we've been sort of connected on LinkedIn for a little while now, haven't we? Because we've got some mutual acquaintances, Peter, for
Yeah.
example, and Colin, the other Colin. So, is in the sort of legal compliance or compliance in the sort of legal firm setting. Is that right?
Yeah, it is now. Yeah, definitely. I mean, much further back, I used to do a lot of fraud prevention, fraud investigation work, working for a couple of the big accountancy firms, and then moved on from there into law firms a number of years back, and worked as a head of compliance and money laundering reporting officer for a fairly large law firm. And then from there, moved into consultancy and do the same job now, but on a consulting basis for law firms.
Yeah, and head of compliance is quite a sort of stressful and interesting role, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah, definitely. It has its moments. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be. There's lots of plates spinning pretty much all the time as a head of compliance. And then when you throw in the money laundering reporting officer job as well, alongside that, it can be quite busy, particularly in a big law firm.
Yeah.
There are some people that hold more roles than that. Some hold the other sort of nominated officer roles alongside head of compliance and MLRO as well. And frankly, it's one of those roles now that I think it needs to be split up. Really, it's impossible to do it all. I think because the regulation has just become so much more intense now than it was.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I know there's a sort of view from some of the compliance officers I sort of talk to and train that the two roles are completely different and shouldn't be together. And it's just a lot to do, isn't it? MLRO
Yeah.
and head of compliance.
Yeah, and then I guess when you throw in the fraud element as well, which we're going to talk about
Yeah,
today,
yeah,
you almost you become a fraud prevention specialist as well, then trying to make sure that the practice doesn't succumb to any fraudulent issues.
yeah, yeah. Because am I right in thinking there's a term for this in sort of law, sort of schema, if you like, COLP?
Yeah, so the COLP stands for Compliance Officer for Legal Practice.
Right.
Basically, it's generally held, or it has to be held by a solicitor, a practicing solicitor. It's generally held by somebody senior, normally a partner in the business. But what you tend to find happens is that role is often done by a senior person for sign-off purposes, but the person that ends up doing a lot of the heavy lifting is actually the head of compliance.
Right.
They do a lot of the day-to-day work. They'll
Yeah.
then refer it up to the person who's the COLP for a signature, if you like, and for approval. But yeah, that's why I think the head of compliance role is probably the most intense role from a compliance perspective
Yeah.
in a law firm, because they're the ones that have a lot of responsibility for the actual day-to-day
Yeah.
doing of the work.
Yeah. I suppose you're pretty much like the organisational policeman, aren't you?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. And you touched on there that we're going to talk about fraud and how that affects law firms, because we could spend an awful long time talking about compliance, but I think we've both got an interest in the sort of fraud angle, particularly around the fraud risk assessments, which we can talk about as well. So, fraud in law firms, how big a problem is it?
I think at one time people would probably have said it's not that big a problem, and actually I still have that said to me when I talk to partners and managing partners at law firms. You kind of say, oh well, it's not really a problem for us. It's not something we're that worried about. However, I think that over the last few years, certainly there's been more and more articles coming out and issues that have come to the surface, if you like, of law firms that have been affected by fraud, and more specifically internal fraud rather than external.
Right.
So I think that the focus over the last, sort of probably the last 5, maybe even 10 years, has very much been on the cyber fraud side of things, the external fraud. How do we stop, people from hacking into our systems, people from defrauding us externally? And I think to some extent the eye's been taken off the ball a little bit in terms of internal fraud.
Right.
And
Okay.
actually, the stories we've seen more recently over the last few years are about people who work internally, people who run the law firms, senior people in these law firms that have defrauded them, have taken money from client accounts, caused issues within the business, and unfortunately, the businesses have gone bankrupt. They've gone under.
It's horrendous. I mean, you'd not think that, would you? You know, I think most of us. I think the populist opinion is if you go to a firm solicitors, then there's trust there, isn't there? Or there should be in a law firm, but it doesn't take. There's always going to be bad apples, of course there is. But
and I think that's again, it's interesting that the increase in this type of fraud, the internal fraud, seems to have gone hand in hand with changes in business models in law firms as well. So some of the business models have changed in law firms where they've moved from being run by and owned by solely by solicitors to now being what they call an ABS model that can be run by and owned by people who aren't solicitors, who are businessmen outside of the practice of law, if you like, who buy a law practice and have the solicitors run it for them, if you like, on a day-to-day basis, but have people who are non-solicitors who are in charge of the business. And actually, on a number of occasions, these law firms that have been affected by internal fraud, it's been the case that those were the models that were in place. The ABS model was in place.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking there, for if somebody wanting to sort of choose a law firm to act for them, how do they actually verify themselves that they are dealing with a practice that's actually owned by lawyers, as opposed to the model you described, which might be, I stress, might be more risky?
Yeah, I think a check on the SRA website is always useful. They list all firms. Yeah. They'll list whether a firm is an ABS model firm or whether it's a typical solicitor-run practice, if you like, a regulated practice. I think, obviously, not wanting to point the finger at certain models and say they're more risky, but I think it's from the perspective of the consumer, using the SRA website in choosing a solicitor is always important, no matter the model of the firm. Make sure that you're dealing with somebody that is regulated, somebody that has good reviews, and there are lots of review sites out there for solicitors as well. Yeah. Make sure it's not somebody that has any disciplinary issues, which the SRA also lists on their website. So those kind of things are the things you're looking for.
Right, that's great advice, Gavin. And I'm thinking now. So if there's a law firm, what could a law firm do to enhance their credibility in terms of the whole sort of fraud angle, and in terms of prevention? What sort of things might they do to sort of be seen to be proactive and in terms of preventing crime and fraud? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, there's lots of different things. I mean, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act that came in last year kind of pushes certainly the very large law firms or the larger law firms into having in place certain fraud prevention measures. It's now it's part of that act. It's a requirement under the failure to prevent fraud offence that they have in place certain measures, certain processes to protect the business from fraud. Yeah. Albeit though that's focused very much on frauds that potentially benefit the business. Right. I think what we're talking about today is the frauds that make the business the victim. The ones that collapse the firm, as we were just saying, the internal frauds. But again, the things you can do to protect yourself there, it's very much about awareness. Something that I spent a lot of years doing, working with not just law firms, with sort of all kinds of businesses, training your staff. Yeah, helping them understand what the red flags are, what to look out for. Again, this is from not just an internal perspective; it's an external perspective as well. Helping your finance and accounts teams understand what the red flags look like, type of things to look for from scammers, from people external to the business. And then I guess one of the biggest things you can do is something that we in the business refer to as a fraud risk review. Yeah. So getting somebody external to come in, have a look at your systems, have a look at your processes, have a look at your accounts to make sure that there's nothing untoward going on there. Yeah. Make sure that you have this segregation of duties in place. Yeah. On the issues that we mentioned earlier, sort of the internal frauds. it's been a key theme that in both of the really big frauds that have occurred recently, there hasn't really been that segregation of duties. So you've had somebody in charge that's been able to put payments onto the system, authorize payments, issue invoices, and you can imagine where that's going with no segregation and the very senior people that can do all of these things. You can create all kinds of different sort of money trails and things like that. And that's obviously what happened or it looks to be that's what's happened in both of these big cases that we've seen recently.
Yeah. So there's a distinction in Act, as you've talked, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, isn't there, between benefit to the business, and so they're acting fraudulently, as opposed to something internal, which is a completely sort of different thing.
Yeah, it's a completely different angle. The business then becomes a victim under the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. There's that failure to prevent fraud offence, but that is, as you say, very much focused on a fraud that might be committed by somebody within the business that benefits the business.
Yeah.
So again, there have been examples that I've seen, certainly in law firms, of solicitors that have facilitated a fraud in some way through a case that they're working on or something like that. Yeah. That's resulted in a benefit to the business because they've taken increased fees, maybe as a result of that work that they've done. But it's actually facilitated a fraud. There's various different examples that you could talk about there. But I think the distinction you make, obviously the fraud that makes the law firm or the business a victim is very much more about, often we see these internal frauds. They don't have to be, huge ones that collapse the firm. Sometimes they're small things that just go on for years and years. Invoicing frauds and diverting funds. We've seen examples of finance directors diverting funds from a client account into their own accounts. We see examples of contractors sending in false invoices or inflated invoices. Conflicts of interest where somebody may be connected to the firm is undertaking some work where there's a potential conflict of interest involved. So again, all things that we consider when we do the fraud risk reviews. We'll look at all those type of areas to see how at risk a firm is.
Yeah, and I suppose that when you start looking at some of the more complex stuff, you might well start with a fraud, but there could be a connection with money laundering, bribery, corruption. It could sort of spiral out of control, couldn't it? Very, very.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of loops back to what you asked earlier about what can they do, and having or putting in place policies around all of these things. Fraud prevention, anti-bribery and corruption, anti-tax evasion. A policy is a policy. It's a piece of paper with words on it, essentially.
Yeah.
But if you put a policy in place and then follow that through into a process, making sure that people are aware of it, people follow those processes, that's where the prevention piece comes in. That's where you start to close the gaps. And I think that's the important first step is maybe making sure that you have those policies. Policies lead to processes. Processes lead to protection. And it's a common analogy that I use when I'm working with law firms.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to hark back to my sort of days in the police about, and I know you've got a public service background as well, but it's the supervision and management that's key to this, because it's great what you said there about policies, and if they lay on a shelf, and they're never reviewed and they're never enforced and they're never visited, they're pointless. And I think, whose job is it then in a law firm to ensure that the policies are followed, that they are exercised, and all that sort of stuff? Do you think that's rigorous enough?
So that goes right back to what we talked about at the beginning about the head of compliance and that stressful role. I think it very much is on the head of compliance and potentially the compliance team if they have one. They'll have people that focus on making sure that the policies are in place, up to date, and then that they follow through into those processes. Often that will mean that there's some kind of checks and balance process in place. It might be reviewing files to make sure that solicitors are doing what they need to do from a compliance perspective to make sure that the firm's protected either from money laundering or from fraud or anti-tax evasion, from all those different angles. But it's very much that monitoring piece that comes in, that I often see when I do audits of law firms, that's where things fall down. People are quite good at putting the policies in place because that ticks a box. And as you say, it then gets put on a shelf and nobody really follows it through. And then the checking piece, making sure that where the processes are in place, people are following them. That's often where it falls down. And it falls down often because, again, the head of compliance or the compliance team don't have enough time or resource to do that checking piece. It can be massively time intensive to sit down and work through 50 files, let's say, and trying to work out whether everybody is doing what they're supposed to be doing on each of those 50 files. You're probably going to have to put a week's worth of time aside to do that. And who has a week's worth of time? So it often falls down at that point where the checks and balances piece, and that's where the gaps appear. And then that's whipping back again to the fraud piece. That's where fraudsters are good at spotting those gaps. They'll spot that actually the law firm doesn't do any file reviews. That they have a fraud prevention policy, but nobody follows it. They have a fraud prevention policy, but they've never really put a process or a system in place. And fraudsters are good at spotting these gaps. And as soon as they spot a gap, that's where it gets exploited.
And I guess if they can identify an insider, then they've got all the intelligence they would ever need, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're then getting into the world of things like data and things like that, which is massively valuable nowadays. If somebody, and again, it does happen inside sort of people in not just law firms, in big business. Corporate espionage is huge. And selling data and moving data, it becomes a massively valuable thing.
Yeah, and without sort of wanting to blow our own trumpet here, you, Peter, our good friend, the fraud guy, and myself worked on that, what we call SAFE, which is security, AML, and fraud, and making sure that sort of a joined up process, because it is. If you don't do all those things together, then you're going to leave a gap, aren't you?
And again, fraudsters are excellent at spotting those gaps. I've done lots of fraud investigations over the years, and it's inevitably one of the things that said to me the most whenever I interview or used to interview people as part of an investigation. They said, "I never thought it'd be that person. Never thought." And it's generally the grey man sat in the corner. Nobody really sort of. It doesn't bring himself to the fore. Nobody really has any concerns about them. And generally, they get on and commit the frauds over a long time. That's why they go unspotted for a lot of the time as well. They're quite clever at keeping the values low, moving the money slowly rather than quickly. The people who get greedy are generally the ones that get caught.
Yeah, you're right, and it all comes down to, I think the largest percentage of people are far too trusting, and some would say people like us are far too untrusting. And it's finding that sort of middle ground, isn't it? But I think that's where the value of an independent consultant comes in, because you can go in with a different pair of eyes. It's whether the firm is motivated enough to bring somebody like yourself or myself or somebody in to do that.
No, that's a great point, and it's something that is, even now, we've seen these articles about these big internal frauds that have collapsed businesses. And even now, I still talk to managing partners of law firms who say to me, "Oh, well, it's not really a concern for us. Fraud's not really an issue for us. We know our staff. We trust our staff." Back to what you just said, my wife says I'm the most cynical man on earth, but I think having worked in fraud for 20 odd years, it does make you cynical. You do become, sadly, untrusting, I think, in some ways. But I would rather be like that than on the wrong end of a £10 million fraud that collapses the business. So I use some of these stories and articles, if you like, in discussions with managing partners to kind of say, well, these people all thought that it wouldn't be them and thought that it didn't occur in their firm, but unfortunately it does. It's always worth having a look at those gaps, and it's things like common practice. And I give a good example of an audit that I did, obviously not mentioning any names, but I went into the accounts department and asked about where they held cash, and they had a safe. And they showed me where the safe was, and it was over in the corner, and it was all locked up, which was great. And I said, and who holds the keys for the safe? So where's the approval route? And they said, oh, we don't bother with all that. We just put the keys on top of the safe so people can let themselves in. But it's common practice because it became an easy thing because lots of people were coming in and asking for access to the safe. Yeah. So somebody came up with the bright idea of putting the keys on top of it.
We'll always find an easy way. We'll always take the easy route as human beings, isn't it?
Yeah,
yeah. ABC always springs to mind.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Do nothing, believe nobody until you check everything. Well, 20 minutes has absolutely flown by, Gavin. I've really enjoyed our chat, and you've given some fantastic advice to anybody listening to this. And people can contact you because this will go out on LinkedIn and YouTube. Can contact you on GDB Consulting is your company.
Yeah.
And I assume that you do very similar to me. People can sort of contact you for a no obligation chat anytime they want.
Absolutely, yeah. Drop me an email, give me a call. The details are all on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And you can find me on there. I'm always happy to have a chat and talk through whether there's something that we can do.
Yeah, exactly. You say prevention is better than cure, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And a lot less expensive.
Definitely, yeah. Well, thank you very much for that, Gavin. Been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. And hopefully people will really enjoy this too and get some cracking views.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Cheers then. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.